We're going to do a different sort of sermon today. I'm going to give a very brief homily, and then Jayne's going to come up and talk about her experiences in Nigeria. So Jesus' resuscitation of Lazarus after 4 days in a tomb is one of the New Testament's most well-known and wonderful stories. In addition to clearly being a foreshadowing of Jesus' own resurrection, it's also an example of a brilliant narrative technique that John uses throughout his gospel. What John does is he'll present Jesus acting to remedy or address a person's well-being on earth or earthly needs, before or after which he'll show Jesus articulating his divine identity, thereby revealing the vital link between the earthly and the spiritual. For example, after physically feeding a crowd of 5,000, Jesus proclaims himself to be the bread of life. Or as in last Sunday's gospel, Jesus restores sight to a blind person, then proclaims himself the light of the world. And then today, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead and proclaims himself the resurrection and the life. This brilliant technique of fusing physical and spiritual in compelling ways and mystical ways reveals that we Christians live in a present, pregnant with possibilities, which John subtly urges us to actualize in our world. This makes today's gospel a perfect one to preface an appeal for our Lenten project. The name Lazarus, which is shorthand for Eliezer, means in Hebrew, God helps. And to drive home the point that we too are called upon to assist God in bringing light to our world, in today's gospel, Jesus doesn't just obliterate the stone in the front of the tomb, he asks bystanders to roll the stone away. Likewise, while today's gospel clearly does foreshadow Jesus' resurrection, it also makes the important theological point that the triumph of life over death is not a future event scheduled for the end times, but rather is present in the here and now to those who believe in Jesus. And finally, today's gospel represents what scholars call a sign story, which typically includes an introduction, and I'm going to be a little lighthearted here about a serious topic. An introduction such as this homily, followed by an appeal, which Jayne is going to make momentarily, then an intervention and a result, as in, let's give the Canadian Network of International Surgeons in Nigeria a huge infusion of much-needed cash. And finally, ending with a discourse, which in our case relates to how our generosity during this Lent is going to contribute to the triumph of life over death for expectant mothers in Nigeria. I am the resurrection and life, Jesus says. The one who believes in me will not die. As Jayne will momentarily entreat, let's give generously to this project this year so that we, in the manner of our Savior, can make these words come true for expectant mothers in Nigeria. And now I turn this over to Jayne.
As some of you may know, my husband Peter and I lived in Nigeria for 2 years over 40 years ago. It was a life-changing experience. We lived and worked in a farming village in Niger State called Doko, teaching at the Teachers College, where the students can graduate and become elementary school teachers. This Lenten project has made me reflect on my time in Nigeria. I came to realize that there were major themes running through my mind: God's presence, generosity, community, and the medical system as we experienced it in Nigeria. God's presence during our lives during this time. We arrived in Kano, Nigeria, ready to meet the people who had hired us. Well, things don't always happen as planned. There was no one there to meet us. We were looking very confused at the airport, and a missionary took pity on us and took us back to the mission. We were not going to be able to go to our destination until after this weekend. We had no Nigerian money, as you could not get it outside the country. These people took us in, they housed and fed us, took us with them to visit some villages, and helped us acclimate ourselves to Nigeria. We learned so much that weekend, and both of us said that if we had to turn around and go home tomorrow, then it would all have been worth it. They arranged for us to go to Doko, including paying the fare for the 6-hour drive. The next part of our journey began. One kind and considerate administrator kindly offered to help us through the bureaucracy each time we did paperwork. There were coups and attempted coups when we were in Nigeria, but the only people that worried were our families back at home. Throughout our experience in Nigeria, we felt safe and looked after by God, our community, and our students. We attended a Christian church in our village. Pastor Ogunlala spent many hours discussing religion with Peter. I remember when we went to the Thanksgiving service, it was a very joyous event. There was a lot of singing, and when it came time to give the offering, people danced and sang up the aisle. The only problem we had was that we gave all our money on the first trip up the aisle, not realizing that we were expected to give many more times as we danced up the aisles again and again. For me, I can feel the Spirit strongly through music and movement. The act of singing and dancing up towards the altar was very powerful. Perhaps we should try this sometime. Community was much different than what we had experienced in Canada. Families lived together in compounds. We lived in a mainly Muslim area, so men could have up to 4 wives. They and their children lived harmoniously, or so it seemed to me, together in a compound. The community welcomed us wholeheartedly and took great pleasure when we learned some of the Nupe phrases, part of the local language. We lived in a school compound just outside the village and were invited to all of the events going on in the school compound and to many events in the village. We were invited to all the parties on the compound, which could often happen spontaneously. People dropped in on each other and shared whatever they had to eat and drink. Anytime someone got a new car, there was a washing party, which did not actually include washing the car, but consisted of drinking beer and listening to music. I remember being invited to 2 staff weddings, one Christian and one Muslim. At the Muslim wedding, the only 2 women at the wedding were me and an Irish colleague. The bride was not there as she was waiting for her husband off in another building. We went to the wake of our principal's mother, to an event to ward off bad spirits called a masquerade, where dancers dressed in costumes with masks, parties to celebrate baby naming ceremonies, and to many different dances and parties. I was lucky to make it home. In one village, the elderly chief, thinking Peter was my brother, offered to buy me as his wife. He offered 2 cows. Luckily, Peter refused, feeling he could get more cows for me in the south. I could have been a permanent part of that community. We were welcomed into every aspect of people's lives. Friendships were developed quickly. Life was joyous and full of music and dancing. Whenever we arrived at someone's house, we were instantly welcomed. No wonder that we loved living there. When we came back to Canada, we felt kind of lonely, as our friends would call us up and arrange to come over in a few weeks, but there was never anything spontaneous or a chance of people dropping in. Reflecting on our experiences makes me realize that community is so important. It also made me think about our refugees and hope that we can give them that same kind of welcome and inclusion in our community as Peter and I were given. Generosity was abundant. It is very humbling when you know people are struggling and they want to give you gifts for teaching their children or for honoring them by visiting their village. I remember receiving gifts of fish, eggs, oranges, eel, and even a quarter of a monkey with the hand included. All of the students and staff lived on the school compound. We were asked to be the medical officers for our students. When I think of that now, I am horrified. What did we know about tropical diseases and medicine in Africa? The only thing we had to help us were compassion and a car to drive the students into the hospital 20 kilometers away. We were given huge jars of tetracycline and vitamin K to disperse at will. In the hospital, families would come to feed their loved ones. Hospitals were open air and were not hygienic. One time I had a boil on the end of one of my fingers, and as I had seen a student who had lost part of his finger by going home for traditional medicine for the same ailment, I thought maybe I should go to the clinic across from the school and see the doctor. I am sure he had never treated a Caucasian before. The way he stroked my hand to look at the finger was a little unnerving. He did give me a medicine called Valium to treat the boil. Being young and naive and never hearing about Valium prior to this event, I went home, took the pill, and had horrible nightmares. It is nearly impossible to create a sterile environment in one's home. The water was delivered weekly, but you needed to boil it to sterilize it for use. A distressing medical issue was when Maria, the woman who lived behind us and whose husband was also a teacher at the school, had her third baby. She was a lovely woman who looked after her two boys without much help from her husband and had no relatives living in that part of Nigeria. She delivered her baby alone in the corner of her bedroom. Likely, through things not being sterilized, Maria developed a very bad infection, and a few days later, we had to drive her to the hospital. She was very ill, and it was unsure if she would make it or not. Luckily, she did recover to enjoy life with her baby daughter, but it left me thinking how dangerous having a child could be without the right care and sterile conditions. Maria's experience would not be unique. Please, when you think of Nigeria, think of the Nigerian people's joy of life, their spirit of community, their generosity, and their need of medical assistance, especially for birthing healthy babies and leaving healthy mothers to be able to look after them. In fact, think of Maria and the expectant mothers like her in Nigeria now. This is our community St. Thomas's chance to be generous to the people of Nigeria, as they were so generous and giving to Peter and me all those years ago. Please, let's do all we can so that mothers and their newborn children, like Maria and her daughter, get the chance to live long lives. Thank you.